Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the last of this term's Imagining Otherwise lecture series. So this series is titled after Lola Olufemi's book, Experiments in Imagining Otherwise. And the lecture series brings together practitioners across disciplines whose work explores themes of identities and centering the margins. It acknowledges and champions lived and embodied experiences, decolonial epistemologies, and decarbonizing spatial and non-spatial discourse. We continue to navigate the space between what is and what could be, and the possibility of living otherwise. The series is chaired by Bushra and Nana from Diploma Unit 2, and from Diploma 13, myself and George. And we're joined this evening by Dr. Huda Tayob. Huda is a South African architectural historian. She's currently a lecturer at the University of Manchester and has previously taught at the University of Cape Town, the University of Johannesburg, and the Bartlett School of Architecture. Her research focuses on minor, migrant, and subaltern architectures centered on the African continent. She is co-curator of the open access curriculum racespacearchitecture.org and co-curator of the digital exhibition Archive of Forgetfulness. The presentation will be followed by a discussion with Bushra, who's going to join us, George, and myself. And then we'll take questions from the audience. And then after that, there will be drinks and canapes. So please do stick around for more informal chat. And I will now hand over to Huda.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to be here today. Is that good? And to share some of this work. So I'm going to talk today about two projects that I've been working on and been involved in over the past few years. The first is a collaborative, co-curated project titled The Archive of Forgetfulness. And then I'll briefly turn to a research project titled Unconfessed Architectures, to think more specifically about architectures of forgetfulness. In thinking with and around forgetfulness, I'm questioning the potential of the archival imaginary in different ways. And so I kind of roughly want to group these two projects around this broader theme. The various sources and archival sites that these projects speak to ask us to engage with the active silencing and violence of erasure, alongside the hopes and aspirations of lives and stories not contained by coloniality. The sources focus on the materiality of the archive, along with exchanges, conversations, and debates, which are central to their production and reproduction in narrative forms. In constituting an archive, Stuart Hall argues that in making an archive, the whole apparatus of a history, periods, key figures, works, and tendencies slips silently into place. Thinking with Hall, this talk asks how we might contend with the material that does not typically enter the urban or architectural archive, or when it does, it enters it through the margins. And it specifically through a focus on various forms of storytelling and the spectral sounds of footsteps. So I am particularly interested in my work more generally in how we meet this forgetfulness, these silences and absences, and how this enables us to contend with the violence of history and the impossibility of certain pasts and certain futures in the world as we know it. And so I think the two key questions which kind of hold this work together, and it's very varied, are around what is the condition of the archival encounter in spatial, material, and emotional terms, and how do archival encounters enable counter-mappings of architecture, the city, geographies, and spaces to allow for wider, alternative, and multiple forms of knowledge and understanding. As with much of my work, this is also about challenging and questioning the limits of architecture, both what it is and what it could be, alongside what it has been, beyond the specificity of the sites and content that I will talk about today. For as Michel Rolfe-Trieux reminds us, it is important to recognize that while people are not always confronting history, the capacity to engage in socio-historical processes and in narrative constructions about those processes is always present. And I think for me, being in an academic space, it's important to remember that we're always operating in these dual roles as narrators and actors. And so this kind of framing for the work here draws on Trieux's work, but also Denise Ferreira da Silva, to suggest that questioning the archival encounter offers more general insights and questions into the concrete production of architectural narratives, historical labor, economies of circulation and production, and points to the imperative for us to think through how architectural and urban histories and narrations work in relation to forms of power. So in other words, I think what I'm really interested in is what do they do and how do they do this? Okay. So the first project that I want to speak to is the Archive of Forgetfulness. The Archive of Forgetfulness is a collaborative Pan-African podcast series, online essay series, and online exhibition funded by the Goethe Institute. It holds 8 podcasts, 22 artist projects, 5 essays, alongside 6 regionally curated works. Amongst these artworks, conversations, and provocations, and I think that their provocations is quite important, are many powerful pieces centered on the African continent, which question forms of entanglement, sonic and textual archives, questions of black flight, dreams of other worlds that could have been possible and may still be, and ways of living otherwise. So I was lead co-curator, yet this is a collaborative project, and I was part of a much wider team of researchers and artists, including co-curator Bongani Kona, and assisted by Zakia Hafaji, who is here today. Along with regional curators, Princess Mhlongo from South Africa, Ali Al-Adawi from Egypt, Eric Ngangare from Rwanda, Omnia Shokat from Sudan, Zubeida Msefer from Morocco, and Jumoke Sanwo from Nigeria. And I think it's important to kind of mention that, although some of the interpretations here are mine, this is very much a collaborative project. Graphics were done by Graham Aronser and Sarah de Villiers, and website design by Fred Kannemeyer, who's actually also here, I think. Hi, there you are, sorry. And the project was developed with the support of the Goethe Institute, but specifically working with Asma Diakite, who's head of cultural programs for Southern Africa, and Kara Sneeman. And again, I do think that it's important to mention their names because a lot of this work wouldn't have been possible without their support. And sometimes that support was really giving us the freedom to do what we wanted to with the work. The project actually builds on a pre-existing Africa-wide Goethe Institute project titled Neighborhoods, which was interested in questions of mobility across the African continent, in opposition to the focus around 2018 on flight and escape. And this was around the time of the kind of what was then termed the migrant crisis. And I think the socio-political context has changed quite a bit. The early phase began in 2018, and it's a phase that I was not involved in, but many of the co-curators were. But even in this kind of later phase, this is a particularly unique project for the Goethe Institutes, as it deliberately involved countries across this colonial regional divide, which is how these institutes are structured, which divide North Africa from sub-Saharan Africa. So these kind of 6 curators were quite key, the 6 regional curators were quite key to how the project was situated from the beginning to question some of these assumed boundaries. And in one of the podcasts, Jihan El-Dahri reminds us, and I quote, and she says, somehow as Africans, we have accepted that there's something called sub-Sahara, that there's this empty thing called the Sahara, and then there's the North, which is another ballgame, and the South, which is something else, end quote. And this is it's quite a key, I think, it's an important feature of how this project functions because it actively questions both how boundaries are drawn and how they're reinscribed in histories, but also this idea of emptiness, where the kinds of absences of places like the Sahara as a space. So in 2020, the beginning of the current life of the project, when I was invited to reframe and take the project forward, we made a move away from the static framing of the neighborhood to ask what it means to think about neighborliness and conversations with neighbors, to rethink borders and to engage with the materialities, histories, and narrations of movement. And this phase of the project actually began during the COVID-19 lockdowns in August of that year, when the ability to move was particularly limited. With our heightened sense of being and breathing, we were acutely aware of the longer and deeper histories of forced immobility and segregation, and of the extractive infrastructures and racial violences made material in how cities across the African continent were imagined and their histories written. And so, drawing inspiration from Mahmoud Darwish's prose-length poem, Memory for Forgetfulness, we questioned how we might engage with what exists in the failure of memory, in that which can no longer be spoken, but also acknowledging forgetting as an active part of remembering. As Anne Whitehead has written, a degree of forgetting is as important as remembering in the aftermath of catastrophes. Forgetting is not only the shadowy underside of memory, but shapes and defines the very contours of what is recalled and what is preserved, what is transmitted as remembrance from one generation to the next, and what is handed down to us in our turn to cherish or discard. In the search for those contours and shapes, however murky or distant, we began the project with invitations to a podcast series as a means to begin to draw outlines of connection across the African continent and across these kinds of territories that have previously been thought of as absence in certain histories and epistemologies, and to draw out connections that have been maintained despite disruptions. So the podcast series, so the project began as both an open call inviting submissions to this archive and with a podcast series which ran from October 2020 to January 2021. And the podcast was kind of functioning as this bridge between the different phases of the project, but also as the site where we hope to open up some of the wider questions we were interested in by inviting in voices, readings, and interviews. And the series, called Conversations with Neighbors, was curated by myself and Bongani Kona, and each episode was structured around a set of questions, some of which you can't really read, I think. Deliberately drawing together into conversation geographical frameworks that exceeded national spaces, along with engaging various forms of archival modalities. So we mapped out and were very mindful in the curation of forms and ways of archiving, which ranged here from oral to sonic, filmic to written, built to performed, and of how these various forms might be spoken to and sit alongside one another in order to prompt further questions and conversations. Each podcast was framed with an attention to a particular set of archival modalities, geographic terrains, and key questions. And these slides, which you can't really see the posters, but these were a set of posters designed for us by Graham Aronser, which draws out some of the geographies and questions. The key questions include what personal, political, and cultural histories emerge via infrastructures of mobility? What remains of political and cultural ideas that imagine the African continent as the utopia of a borderless world? And perhaps an overarching question too broad to answer. How do the dreams of freedom of other worlds that might have been possible and ways of living otherwise haunt our present? Okay. So I'm going to quite briefly introduce some of these stories from the podcasts as a way to, I guess, to introduce some of the ideas that emerge. And I've chosen a set that I think that specifically relate to architecture for the purposes of this conversation and where we're cited today. But as I was saying, at the start of this talk, this project is not specifically architectural. That was not part of the initial intention, although it did involve a set of architects at different points and in different phases. So in episode 3, architectural theorist Mena Agha gives voice to the Nubian bonds of kinship that survive the crossing of vast territories between Sudan and Egypt, a practice which rejects borders, ruptures, and distances. Agha narrates the story of her great-grandmother as a stand-in for an entire generation of Nubian women who saw the closing down of borders between Egypt and Sudan. She points to the paradox of this postcolonial moment in Egypt, where Gamal Abdel Nasser's ideas of PanAfricanism were contrasted with the racialized treatment of Nubians and the mass displacement of villages in the forming of Lake Nasser or Lake Nubia. Yet she also points importantly to the labor and work done by women like her great-grandmother to maintain connections across the border between postcolonial Egypt and Sudan, which she describes as a rejection and refusal of the status quo. These are worlds constituted through active relationships despite vast distances and the arduous journeys that needed to be endured. This new landscape of displacement villages formed in the postcolonial moment of promise marks the shadowy underbelly of the utopian ideals of the moment of liberation. This narrative was mirrored by architectural historian Kukwa Manful's description of similar contradictions found in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana from its inception in episode 4. As Manful notes in a similar conclusion, yet reflecting on the Togoland region, the postcolonial moment opened up possibilities of connections across borders and the idea of a borderless world and a united Africa in the vision of Nkrumah, and yet set in place national borders. In particular, Manful reflects on the place of minor histories in deepening our reading of Pan-Africanism. As Kukwa reflects, drawing on Anne Stoler, minor histories should not be mistaken for trivial ones. And her practice looks across building permits in Accra, not just for the kind of official documents and what they tell us, but also the minor notes and stories that are often overlooked in research. In a very different vein, in episode 7, in an interview with Bongani Kona, the novelist Ivan Adiambo Owor opens up the question of the African oceanic imaginary and the wider relationship with oceans. She questions the names we have for the Swahili seas, and through her research points to wider, longer, and deeper histories of engagement with the waters, and an imaginary that extends beyond Africans only being cargo in the Middle Passages, and the limitation of history to atrocity. In particular, she draws on Haji Gora Haji, a poet and seafarer from Zanzibar, in her search for Swahili poem maps. These poem maps are navigational maps of the waters, recited by sailors to find their way. Haji Gora Haji describes reciting his way from Tumbatu Island in the Zanzibar archipelago to Yemen by a play of words, a verbal enunciation of mapping. This is a form of poetry and mapping that continues and expands histories of narration and narrations of history, building on practices that operate across text and voice and across seas. And maybe we can listen to a short excerpt of one of the poems read by Halima Ali, who's also here today.
Ukichungua bahari ina mengi yalosiri hata ukiwa hodari. Bahari ina mawimbi kadhalika na vitimbi kama sirangi na vumbi. Mengi yasoidadika pindi ukisadifika lazima hutetemeka. Ikiwa umo chomboni, kaa utulie ndani, ukitizama majini. Bahari usichungue, omba Mola akubue. Be wary before the ocean, it remains cryptic, however intrepid you are. The sea contains waves, other mysteries and riddles. Where it is not for the color and dust, unaccountable things there are. When it approaches, you must tremble. When you are in the vessel, concentrate on your confines, for should you glimpse the jinns, don't drop too deeply into the sea, beseech God's help. Kusafiri huwafiki.
Move on. And then closer to home for me, Ilse Wolff, an architect based in Cape Town, shared a reading of her essay and the work of South African writer Bessie Head. In an early poem called My Home, Bessie Head invites us into her home. She writes, "Come and see my home. It's any place where nobody gives orders." End quote. This is clearly an invitation which Ilse Wolff follows in some of her research, and an invitation that asks that anyone who accepts this should take a certain responsibility. So Wolff writes, "Tread softly, the walls breathe peace, deep, dark, black peace, and the wind don't blow." This is an essay that excavates the archives of Bessie Head and brings this into conversation with questions of flight and breath from Cape Town to Nagasaki. And then perhaps lastly, from the podcasts, to mention the contribution by Omar Barada in a response to the question of how we might trace the afterlives of the trans-Saharan trade routes of the 8th century. Barada traces the personal histories of his once enslaved great-grandmother in Morocco. In this deeply personal reflection, he starts by describing Zagora, and I quote, "In Zagora, an oasis town in the southeast of Morocco, there is a painted sign that says, 'Timbuktu, 52 days.' The road sign maintains a vision of Africa as a separate, faraway place, far even from itself. But we know that that distance has been crossed countless times over many centuries. Zagora, as we know it, is partly made out of Timbuktu, and Timbuktu, as we know it, is partly made out of Zagora." End quote. And he reminds us in this episode of the histories of crossing the Sahara, of the histories of violence, histories of slavery, but also that travel is never innocent. These are a few shared excerpts of the many stories gathered and generously shared with us. Beyond the specificities of these stories and the details of the histories, gestures, bodily acts of remembering, and searching for names that have been forgotten, these conversations point to questions around archival labor, entangled geographies, the fullness of space and site, and the many forms that these navigations might take and ways they might live. They suggest alternative epistemic formations as decidedly undisciplined and point to a productive engagement with what might be an assumed absence. The conversations act as points to interrogate the archival encounter, suggesting a relational mapping through lines of connection that may have been forgotten but have not been lost and are certainly not absent. These are stories that are never innocent, and distance as always loaded with an ethic of relation. So in April 2021, we launched the Archive of Forgetfulness website with the responses to the open call, which consisted of 22 selected artworks and 5 essays. And I'm not going to speak about these projects, there are too many, but I would invite you to engage with them further, just in the interest of time. Beyond maybe to mention that some of them draw out histories of relationships to land, relationships to solidarities across geographies, and questions of belonging. And then over the course of 2021, there were 6 regionally curated projects that were shared throughout the year. And as I mentioned briefly, the regional curators have all been involved in this work since 2018 for some of them. And more generally, these are works that both expand the methods and questions, but also ask different set of questions around how we might think of archives. And they extend from, these are the 6 projects as an overview, but they extend from Eric Ngangare's work, which offers ruminations on cross-border living between Kigali and Bujumbura, through an incredible film essay that focuses on the urban conditions in these 2 cities, drawing in a wide range of voices and experiences. Maybe we can watch a clip. Just an excerpt. So that project really asks us to think about these 2 cities as intricately entangled because of the various histories of cross-border living, including histories of conflict, but also histories that predate that. Princess Mhlongo's work was the second project to be launched and is a collection of and engagement with the meaning of clan praises, Izibongo and Izitakazelo, of names lost and found in the course of migration, where she asks, where do we go to remember who we once were? In this poignant question, Mhlongo asks us to think through and work through a spatial relationship of memory. Jumoke Sanwo's project is Dunadura, engages with the Obalende night market in Lagos as a space that operates between the living and dead. And the project aims to create a space of encounter and renegotiation. This is a work that was a live on-site event with performances by Aremo Gemini and Jalili Atiku, which was live streamed at the time, and part of an extensive conversation series held in the market, allowing the work to operate across registers, mediums, and audiences with deliberate intent. Omnia Shokat's piece speaks to the politics of art in contemporary Sudan and is a compilation of research on various art and cultural institutions that emerged through the revolution. Alongside the online work, there was a series of local conversations in Khartoum that formed part of this project. And then Ali Al-Adawi's project asks how we might engage with archives speculatively, situating Egypt as part of an African neighborhood, which draws together 3 pieces, including a video work by Mohammed Abdel Karim on speculating on the disappearance of the Mediterranean, a DJ set by DJ El Contessa, and both of these were held there were live events in Alexandria around their release, and then a speculative essay by Haitham Shater, which imagines Alexandria as a Nubian city. And then Zubeida Msefer's work is the final regional curated project, which searches for archival traces of Yasmine, the slave wife of her great-grandfather in Morocco. And in her work, which was in part inspired by Omar Barada's contribution to the podcast series, she finds more absences than presences, but this big project then becomes a means to look at how these histories have been unmade in contemporary Morocco. Each of these projects has and continues to operate independently and as part of the Archive of Forgetfulness, with their own conversations, localities, and specificities. I think for this project, they offer a series of provocations, open up questions, and engage with history's archives and spatial archives in quite particular ways. And you can also see more of this online if you're interested. In an essay on the, as part of this project by curator and writer Hopalang Moooi, she suggests that gestures of gratitude might offer a modality and form of engagement with the archive anew. Central to her own work are the acts of reflecting, imagining, dreaming, and communing, as she follows the history of an enslaved woman, Huda Tayob, in the Cape Archives. For Moooi, drawing on Saidiya Hartman, gratitude encourages us to recognize the importance of others in making our lives livable when history is a catastrophe. Many of the works in this collection engage with the forgotten, marginal, or minor through acts of remembering the labor, resistance, and refusal. The work of memory is a labor of care that works against silencing and neglect, a memory for forgetfulness. Or to refer to Yusuf, Catherine Yusuf, drawing on Tina Kampt, for the future real conditional, that which will have had to happen. As Stuart Hall notes, to think from peripheries and mobility enables us to catch the world in all its unpredictabilities. From this position, there emerges the possibility of engaging with history anew. Questions of power as well as entanglement are always at stake. And the archive becomes a site of possibility. Okay, so I want to briefly share a second project, and I'll try and keep this kind of brief in the interest of time. And this is a project it's a research project that I've been working on in various forms, which looks at Cape Dutch architecture in Cape Town, and by extension, the foundations of architectural history in South Africa. And is a way, I think, to think more specifically about architectural archives, but also architectures of forgetfulness. New Year's Day, Thanksgiving service. January 4th, 1699. Fine rains for the grapes and gardens. January 8th, 1699. A female slave found murdered near the hospital. January 8th, 1699. Those in Robben Island, deceived by the mist, mistook the coaster for a frigate, hence the firing. The précis of the archives of the Cape of Good Hope, covering the period 1699 to 1732, begins with these listed items. In the first few days of 1669, there was a New Year's service, fine rains for the abundant gardens, a murder, and deceptive mists. This initial list is followed with longer descriptions of battles and trade, of convicts brought to the Cape, of rumours and intrigue. These carefully recorded daily events are drawn from the longer archives and cite the small settlement known as the Cape of Good Hope, somewhere between Colombo, India, Madagascar, Mauritius, the Netherlands, and the British Isles, as we know these places today. I came across these archival records to research for stories about some of the old Cape houses and their histories. They are cited as important accounts in two of the earliest architectural histories of the Cape by Dorothea Fairbridge and Alice Trotter. Slavery in the Cape Colony was officially the central form of social, cultural, and economic life from 1658 to 1834, at least. People were captured and enslaved in Mozambique, Madagascar, Malabar, India, and Southeast Asia primarily, as well as from indigenous Khoi and San populations. In contrast to the Atlantic Middle Passages, slavery at the Cape has largely been portrayed as mild up until at least the 1980s. And this supposed mild nature has been emphasized in a range of popular texts, cookbooks, and paintings. and architectural histories, which often depict idyllic scenes of pastoral farm living in what are effectively plantations. And until quite recently, even the term plantation is not widely used in the South African, in the way histories are written in around architectural histories. In contrast, Habiba Badroun and Pumla Deneokola, among other scholars, draw on research into the Office of the Protector of Slaves to argue that slavery in the Cape enforced a system that exposed women involved in domestic labor to serial violence and systematic sexual abuse. So this representation of slavery as mild has become a means to evade the deep histories and hauntings of the violence that were enacted and of the inheritances of slavery in society and space. As I showed in the first few lines of the précis, January 8th, a female slave was found murdered near the hospital. Architecture is, of course, no exception in portraying this mildness. Yet there are deep submerged histories and hauntings which are evident in tracings, slippages, and holes in narratives in architectural archives documenting slave-owning homes in the Cape. So as Gayatri Spivak has argued, if in the context of colonial production, the subaltern has no history and cannot speak, the subaltern as female is even more deeply in shadow. In the context of slave histories, this draws attention to the impossibility of a full representation or record, particularly in relation to the female as subaltern, who is not in a subject position from which to speak in the first place. So let me briefly introduce you to Cape Dutch architecture. The term Cape Dutch architecture most commonly refers to the whitewashed houses and stuccoed homesteads built in the Cape Colony between the 1650s and 1810s, the period when the Dutch were the main rulers of the Cape. These houses are usually characterized by a thatched roof and an entrance stoep or veranda and a dominant central gable, were generally situated in slave-owning plantations. Groot Constantia, a large plantation and homestead close to Cape Town, was declared South Africa's first national monument in 1936. And so in many ways, Cape Dutch architecture and the writing of it through these early texts, through a particular set of early texts, is the beginning of architectural history in South Africa. This is an image from Groot Constantia. The foundations of this origin moment, however, are laid in the preceding years with the publishing of what are generally considered the first architectural histories of South Africa, which chronicle, name, and construct Cape Dutch architecture as significant. And these are notably Alice Trotter's Old Cape Colony and Dorothea Fairbridge's Historic Houses of South Africa. While the case of Groot Constantia was formed and spurred by a revivalist movement, which was short-lived, the declaration, this moment is quite significant and has arguably led to the predominance of Cape Dutch architecture as a venerated style and area of study up until the 1990s. And I think evidence of this is still present today in architectural education in South Africa and certain kinds of dominant tropes that remain significant. In the early 20th century, these houses were, however, written into a fictional genealogy of manor homes belonging to landed gentry. And central to this rescripting is the dual practice of narrating slavery as mild, alongside the concurrent erasure of the presence or contribution of slave labor to these homesteads, both in terms of actually having built them, but also the presence within them. And so you see here one of these, this is from a 20th century archive, where you have the house, a typical house described, and then the caption says slave quarters were usually formed in a courtyard behind. So the place of the architecture is relegated to the caption. As Catherine Youssef argues in relation to geology, origins configure and prefigure the possibility of narratives of the present. The origins of architectural history in South Africa, I argue, establish a material, aesthetic, and discursive space inscribed with a relationship of power. And into the present, despite being slave households, these houses are very rarely considered in relation to the longer histories of slavery. Yet there are moments, even within these early writings, where slavery is hinted at. And these are the traces that I'm particularly interested. In a brief passage describing the house Waterhoof, Fairbridge notes that, and I quote, "Waterhoof is a place wherein to see visions and dream dreams. Legend says that you may hear the pattering footsteps of the mutinous slaves wherever you care to listen for them." And later in the passage, she writes, "The legend which hangs about so many old Cape homes has a home at Waterhoof." In these few lines, Fairbridge acknowledges the same story in relation to a series of other homes in the Cape, including Welgelegen and Nooit Gedacht. And these are stories that are evident in various kinds of archival margins. For Fairbridge's readers, amidst the detailed drawings and genealogical underpinnings of the gabled homesteads and their owners, which are the dominant content, these passages hold traces of the more violent histories. These houses, as always embodied with the ghosts of the slave body and her footsteps, mark mutiny as resistance. However, by Fairbridge's own acknowledgement, these footsteps are only heard by those who care to listen to them. Waterhoof, or Water Manor, is named for the large freshwater spring located adjacent to this house in the Table Valley, and it's described by Fairbridge in a few paragraphs in relation to its more stately neighbour Leeuwenhof, as follows. And this is an image of the house in the background and the gardens in the foreground. Equally blessed in soil and situation, it had a glorious garden not long ago, a garden in which steps of Batavian bricks led you from one terrace to another, in which you lost yourself in the luxuriant tangle of honeysuckle, myrtle, jasmine, and scarlet passionflower. End quote. This garden is described as both blessed in soil and situation, is located in the foot of Table Mountain. The sheltered natural amphitheatre is surrounded by Lion's Head and Devil's Peak, the names for two of these mountain peaks, with spring water and fertile soil. The freshwater system feeding the spring, known as Camisa, is a creolized term from the Khoi language which refers to the city of Cape Town, denoting the 40 tributaries which run through the valley, and can be translated as sweet water of the people. Beyond the description of the abundant natural beauty, Waterhoof, as I've mentioned, is home to a legend which, as Fairbridge notes, hangs about so many of these homes. So after this note on the visions, dreams, and footsteps within Waterhoof, Fairbridge returns to describe the gable and the general splendour of these homes, among others. But for me, what is interesting is what these footsteps tell us and what they leave out. So the story is about these footsteps of a woman that are heard and of a child, of an infant child that is saved within an oven made of Batavian bricks in the garden. Did only the infant child survive? And what happened to the slaves who were planning this mutiny? Did they escape to the surrounding mountains? Were they caught? And who else has cared to listen to this pattering sound? This brief interlude of a slave revolt, retold among the beauty of the garden, is followed by an acknowledgement of the heavy hand of time on these Cape houses, before moving on to similar houses and their kind of lineage of ownership. Yet the ubiquitous nature of these stories and the narrative force of these offhand tales repeated frequently amidst amidst the other architectural details, asks to be read again. Amongst whom are these stories told? Who shared these tales? What happened to the young slave girl and the child who was saved? These are stories that exceed the architecture, yet are embedded within the Batavian brick oven, deeply entrenched in the tangle of honeysuckle, myrtle, jasmine, and scarlet passionflower, the smells and sights of which recall roots of empire enslaving. The stories travel across time and space, marking the presence and absence of slave lives in these houses and land. Spivak asserts that even when the subaltern does speak, we do not know how to hear her. Fairbridge's choice of words aptly points to those who care to hear the footsteps of mutinied slaves, suggesting too that perhaps if we care, we might hear. As Spivak asserts, the subaltern only enters the archive as a disturbance or at moments of crisis, and always through mediations of power. For me, the spectral footsteps speak to fear and anxiety, projection and panic of conquest. The haunting offers a temporal refusal of displacement and erasure. They position the archive as emotive and contested, even when it claims otherwise. The slave woman's footsteps are a point of recall and return. No matter how faint her pattering might be, she disrupts history and architecture, insisting on the circularity of time for those who care to listen. As Avery Gordon notes, the spectral is a seething presence, not simply a dead or missing person, but a social figure. And so caring to hear the footsteps of these ghostly female presences leads us back into the density of the archive, where, as Gordon reminds us, social life is made and disrupted. She writes, and I quote, "The present wavers, something will happen," end quote. The disembodied pattering, heard but not seen, draws architecture into relation with property, personhood, water and mountain, but also sound. Okay, so to conclude. I want to return to the questions that I started with, where I'm interested in what is the condition of the archival encounter in spatial, material, and emotional terms, but also how do we think about architectural forgetfulness? How do we think about archival encounters as enabling counter mappings of architecture and the city to allow for wider alternative and multiple forms of knowledge and understanding? But by extension, how do we think about architectural forgetfulness? Wherein this space of forgetfulness is presented as socially and politically productive site, as a necessary and sustained irresolution that resists closure. And I think this also leads into what are the limits of history and the limits of architecture, and what do we do in this space where there are no words, or maybe no words. Remembering and archival work can be a choice to carry or a weight to bear, where forgetting is always present and active. In Memory for Forgetfulness, Mahmoud Darwish moves from the urgent to mundane in the midst of crisis, to the aroma and smell of coffee, the sound and senses of a siege, writing in Beirut, alongside the weight and depth of history. He writes, and I quote, "It has had a long history, this double operation of searching for a place or time on which to put a signature and untie the knot of the name, facing the long caravans of oblivion." End quote. Forgetting is not only the shadowy underside of memory, but shapes and defines the contours of what is recalled and what is preserved, what might be deemed minor or trivial. In the search for those contours of futures, past and present, however murky or distant, is where the potential of the archival imaginary is cited. rejecting the assumed transparency of a binary position. For Edouard Glissant, there is opacity now at the bottom of the mirror, and this is a quote, "A whole alluvium deposited by populations, silt that is fertile, with an insistent presence that we are incapable of not experiencing," end quote. As Glissant notes, opacity is not obscurity or that which is unclear. It is instead a necessary engagement with relationality, a total dreamed-of freedom of possibilities. So for me, in these two projects, beyond momentary engagements to draw out direct connections among the works, is the importance of the positional and relational field that has been collectively built and assembled through, or in particular, through a project like the Archive of Forgetfulness. An archive of contestation against lines of force, positioned in relation to historicity, futurity, and contingency, an engagement and an interruption into a far from settled field, and an insistent presence in the face of imposed forgetfulness in the different forms that that takes. In episode 1 of Conversations with Neighbours, the first podcast series, conversation between myself, Ali Al-Adawi, and Jumoke Sanwo, two of the regional curators, we discussed what it means to think about anti-colonial and cross-border archives through questions of the untranslatable and opaque. The conversation points to archiving as a site of possibility, a portal for imagination, and a space from where we might confront history. Jumoke Sanwo suggests that the Yoruba word for archive, itoju, can be translated as care. And indeed, the question of how we might build anti-colonial archives as resources that are expansive and open-ended is very much a work and labor of care. So while this work is admittedly undisciplined and open-ended, the various stories together point to a series of openings. To return to Stuart Hall, archives are never inert historical collections. They always stand in active dialogic relation to the questions which the present puts to the past. And the present always puts its questions differently from one generation to another. Drawing in a range of histories, contexts, sites, offers a contestatory position, but also questions whether returning to these sites and stories, often overlooked by disciplinary boundaries, can enable us to escape the repetition of this violence and suggests alternative ways of reading and writing across borders, south and north, center and periphery, where caring to listen and hear becomes a mean of acknowledging practices of refusal. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Huda. That was amazing. Really generous. Thank you for going through your multiple layers of working practices that you carry out. I have so many questions, but I'm going to focus in on one. I want you touched on it very briefly, sort of interspersed in the whole presentation, but I wondered if you could expand a bit more on how you consider or treat this balance between the regional, the Pan-African, and the global, and how you, I guess, start to tease out what those relationships are today.
Do you mean that in the Archive of Forgetfulness? Or
yes, in all your practices. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question because it's in many ways it's kind of at the core of how a lot of this work is situated. I think I suppose the answer relates to two kind of things. So the one is how, for a project like the Archive of Forgetfulness, although I spoke a little bit about Pan-Africanism as something that's quite key to the work, and it was quite key to the framing and to the conversations that Bongani and I had in developing the podcast series, specifically in thinking about this particular moment of Pan-Africanism that emerged with the liberation movements as a moment of possibility, that really imagined a reshaping of the position of Africa in relation to the world. And so a lot of these questions are actually quite directly related to that. So thinking about, and some of the projects and conversations that I didn't mention are quite closely related to that, like those quite particular political ideals that are situated at that moment in time. And that was quite important because in many ways that's the kind of starting point for the project and for the conversations. And important that it's actually cited in a very particular historical moment. But what we're also very aware of, and I think throughout the project, are the contradictions of those moments and the kind of what are often seen as the failures of those moments or the failed possibilities for various reasons. And so, and also to realize that even in that moment of Pan-Africanism, which is quite particularly cited in certain parts of the continent, Egypt with Gamal Abdel Nasser and Ghana with Nkrumah, Pan-Africanism was always also about a kind of diasporic blackness, and its histories can also be traced to much longer lineages and wider histories. And so there's always this kind of there were always these wider geographies that are part of this conversation, even if sometimes unspoken. And I think that's important because even when we think about what it means to think about the possibilities and failures, a lot of these ask us to bring in these entanglements with world politics, with global movements, with into various kinds of interventions that happened, but also with the kinds of economies of knowledge production and the economy and how histories circulate within that. And I think that a lot of this work, a lot of my work and a lot of this work is quite particularly, it's cited in that way, in that it's both very particular but always pointing to those bigger questions. Because those are questions that I don't think we can ignore, regardless of whether you're cited here in London at the center of empire or in a place like South Africa. We're very much part of the same kinds of economies, even if they operate in different ways.
Thank you. Great answer. Do you guys have a question? Otherwise, I'll keep going.
I can go next. Thank you, Huda. That was really incredible. While you were presenting, sorry, I'm going to try another one. Yeah, maybe this is better. Yeah. While you were presenting and talking through some of the projects that are in the Archive of Forgetfulness, Adrienne Marie's Brown's voice was kind of in my orbit, and I was thinking a lot about how she speaks about the imagination and how we are living in the imagination of a very particular kind of set of folks. And everything about how we orient our bodies is, or orient towards our bodies is shaped around kind of an imagination of fear. And so I was thinking about like the archive as a kind of site of possibility. I wondered if you could speak maybe a little bit more about the role of the imagination in the work that the archive hosts. I suppose for liberation, but maybe not, I don't know.
Okay, Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's just wondering how. So maybe I'll speak about it through this project that I'm working on with Cape Dutch architecture, which I realize today is actually it's been 10 years that I've been working on it, kind of peripherally to a lot of other work. And part of how that project started was that I was writing an essay about, I was reading a novel actually called Unconfessed by Yvette Christianse, who is a novelist whose work, and the particular novel Unconfessed, traces the history of a slave woman in the Cape. And I was reading this novel, and it's an incredible novel based on archival research, which I later found out, and I didn't know at the time. But it was such an evocative engagement with a set of geographies and sites and places that I knew very well being from Cape Town, but had never really understood in the same way. And because it is really a story that centers this particular slave woman and her experiences in a set of houses in the Cape. And so in reading this, I kind of thought, well, okay, how do we what does it mean to read this kind of fiction against architectural history? And that project started by this kind of reading across these two forms. But what it then led me to was the fictions of the archive. So people like Stuart Hall or various sorts of archival theorists, people like Spivak work quite a lot with this, have very clearly enunciated that the archival fictions are always present. And I think through postcolonial theory or decolonial theory, we increasingly know that. But I have to say, like, for me, it was really it was the first encounter. So reading the archive through the novel was a really kind of interesting encounter that I think also opened up a set of possibilities for starting to read these minor details, like the spectral footsteps, or how certain kinds of traces play out in how things are written. So I think it's really interesting that February just says that comment, that for those who care to listen, because in a way it's this uncanny return of that thing that is actively being erased in that same document. So I think for me, the way that I think about archives as a site of imaginary is that while they're in the kinds of archives I look at, there's an immense violence in them, in how they're written, in how they're positioned, in what they are as sites, in accessing certain archives. This is all part of the encounter, what you can access and what you can't, depending on who you are or where you are. But within that violence, which I do think is important to acknowledge and also confront, are these various things that are not meant to be there. And for me, it's in that we find the possibilities, because as much as because the archives are not only a record of what they were intended to be. There's always these kinds of slippages, and I think that's where the kind of possibility is to, in my work, to ask different questions and to look at these histories in a very different way.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your talk. I was also maybe along similar lines thinking about when you were saying the kind of the archive and then the imaginary and the need to kind of question the origin and how it affects the present. And I was wondering about we were also talking before about the race-based architecture and that as a form of archive as well. And I was wondering if you know what the afterlives of your archives that you've been working on have been since you've kind of put them out, both the one you showed and also the kind of curriculum that I know that has come up quite a lot actually in conversations in the past couple of years with everything that's been going on. And just if you know about the afterlives that they've had.
Yeah, it's quite amazing because sometimes like, you know, you do these projects and then they're kind of sitting there on the side, except for occasional like emails. But both of these projects travel very widely, which is it's quite amazing to see. And I think, and I often, you know, sometimes get kind of responses from people. I've seen them in various kinds of curriculum projects. I get emails from students who just happen to have found it through Google searches and then write to me, or Tandi, for instance, also I know gets emails like this. And it's incredible that they, I think, hold a place of being a resource for people. I think what they do is really, you know, part of putting them out there is letting people do with it what they would like to. But also what's been quite interesting about like this project is that I know that it's led to various other kinds of work and conversations that has also been like really amazing to see. So like there's an amazing project by Sarah Salem and Mena Agha, who are both contributors here, who've this project called Disembodied Territories, which is an incredible kind of archive of itself, and in some of it conversations that we had around this that led to them. There were other reasons for them starting that as well, but I know like even with some of the regional curators, some of the work has been extended, or Zubeida actually told me, so just a few weeks ago she said she's done a second version of this project. She's done a series of interviews and podcasts, continuing the search for these archival traces of Yasmine. So sort of an imprecise answer, but I think it seems to exist in different kinds of formats and sites, which is wonderful to see.
Thank you. I'm just wondering about time, if we should be opening up.
Definitely open to the floor. So yes, if anyone has any questions, Harriet's got a roving mic. Otherwise, I can pass this over as well. I'll ask a question. Oh, over here, yes.
First of all, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting and evocative, and just a byproduct of everything. As a fellow Manchester alumni as well, I just recently graduated, so I just thought it's strange we never met. I had a question. Do you feel your journey of this kind of like exploring this kind of idea of borderless Africa and this narrative, as well as it's kind of at the same time constantly being erased, but then you're picking these archival threads to piece it together with these stories? Do you feel like, you know, in a way, you're kind of giving, or at least giving a chance to kind of rewrite the history that is kind of now affecting the present and then hopefully the future, of like giving a chance for people to write their own history? And what do you kind of take from this kind of journey that you've undertaken?
Thank you for that. I think it's, so for me, like working with the Archive of Forgetfulness was such an incredible experience, for various reasons, and I learned so much through the process. And part of it was quite the amazing people involved in the project, but also the incredible kind of work that is happening in so many different places by so many people. And so I think, you know, and this is kind of with working with the idea of forgetfulness, I think hopefully what also came across is that in many ways it is about the absences and what's erased, but it's also about how certain kinds of narratives are actually very present and continue to be present. And I think this work is, I think the way that it's informed my own practice and my own work as something that sits beyond the kind of more formal academic work, is that it has opened for me a set of ways of thinking about certain questions that quite directly questions, that insists on a quite direct rethinking of the kinds of categories that are often assumed within academic boundaries. And I think it's something that maybe I was always interested in, but wasn't always sure how to do. And, you know, for me, each of these projects does this in a slightly different way. And these kinds of categories are, questioning them is really key to kind of getting at this, what people like Hortense Spiller call the kind of grammar of capture. So how, you know, when we think about the histories of disciplines, they're very much entangled with histories of coloniality and empire, disciplines as we know them now. But, and knowledge production is part of this enterprise. And so we know this, I think, through disciplines like anthropology have more directly tackled this, but architecture has been slightly less willing to engage with it. But I think we need to do that work of kind of questioning what are the implications of thinking of sub-Sahara as distinct from North Africa, north of the Sahara, for instance. What are the kinds of power relations that it enables and maintains? And so I think this kind of work operates across in different ways, like, because those, I think, it's those disciplinary boundaries, disciplinary grammars that really do that work of disciplining into particular ways, and I think stop us from asking these questions of what is the work doing, and how is it actually leading, what does it do in the world?
It's so great that you bring up discipline, because I think that was kind of what my question was about, because I guess to a layman they would see the work that we see presented in front of it seem to be more of like a curatorial practice rather than the practice of archiving, because we often associate that with being evidentiary or historical or, disciplined in a certain extent. Mm-hmm. But I think, to kind of question, what is considered part of an archive, what is considered an artwork rather than evidence, what is, how do you put this work together to kind of create a new truth in a way? And I think there's a lot of massive potential to look at curatorial practices, also not the curation of an exhibition or a collection of, I guess, aesthetic objects, but actually truth-making mechanisms, I guess. And I one thing that I just keep thinking about when I see this work is that a lot of this work that we see, not only in this archive, but being done now, there's a lot of activist artists now looking at stuff that are often investigative to a certain extent and revealing kind of counter-truths that cannot necessarily be pursued on a litigation or a practical standpoint, but asking questions that involve social justice that don't have a practical means. And I definitely see also this idea of then archiving and reframing a curatorial practice as archiving rather than exhibition making. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I think it is, it definitely is, it definitely is a curatorial practice as much as it is an archival practice. But in many ways, I think archival practices are always curatorial. They're always selections. They're always produced by someone or some set of people, some set of institutions in particular ways. So even when things slip in that are not meant to be there, which I think also happens with curatorial work, there's always a presence. I think there's, I also do, I think there's a lot of incredible work, and both this project and I think race, space and architecture are quite clearly, are very explicitly positioned as one of many types of work. And that's quite important also, because I think that within academic frameworks, we're always asked to position ourselves as doing something inventive and new. And actually, this in itself is a kind of fiction of the way that power operates. But I think beyond the kind of curatorial intention, there is an interest in history that I'm very interested in, because I do think that one of the things that happens with the world we live in and the kind of conditions we live in is that which I think goes back to your question earlier, and especially in parts of the African continent, is that we have these very short memories about history. So in South Africa, if you study history in a South African school today, it starts in 1948 and it ends in 1994. And that is a very, and of course that's that's the apartheid history of the country, which is important, but it's also a very kind of neat packaging of a set of complex issues that start much earlier and extend into the present. And in that work, what actively gets erased is that complexity, are these kinds of connections that question like what the nation state is and what it is doing. And I think in various forms, I think that operates in different ways. We might say that it is how nations operate. They operate with an active kind of forgetfulness. So I think for me, I think for me, between curating and archival, I think there's a kind of connection. I do think it's important to also question certain kinds of curatorial practices. Like, when I say I'm asking this question of what does the work do, but I'm also curious about who the audience is, so who it can reach and how. But also that for me, beyond that kind of, that engagement with these as a set of works is actually even if in only small, in a 5-minute excerpt, what it's pointing to are like with the Swahili poem maps, it's pointing to an entire history told through Swahili poetry and epics, which I think is just, it's an entire world in itself. And I think each of these projects do that in different ways.
Hello. Thank you very much for that. I'll just say again that your voice is also incredibly soothing. So I was very enthralled the whole process. So my question, I guess, comes from a slightly different space. I guess in this narrative you talk about in terms of the traces of memories and the footprints of forgetfulness, and even though they're seemingly quite fleeting and faint, they're imbued with so much weight to them, and the sort of trace that you get from trauma, from violence, and deeply personal, and somewhat can be quite vulnerable spaces. I guess I would just like to know your thought process and the way you navigate within these spaces of vulnerabilities for these storytellings to sort of comes out in these your role as a curator or kind of an archival process of it.
Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, I think it's an important question, and I'm not sure that I have a direct answer. I think it's something that I think about quite a lot, because as I was saying earlier, a lot of these archives have a kind of, there's an immense violence to them, whether it's the archives that I'm reading or those that have been shared in different ways. I think one of the things that was very important for us in this project, in the Archive of Forgetfulness, but also in my own work, is that we need to acknowledge and confront that violence. So, because I think that is the condition that we live in. That is the condition. Well, not just what we live in, but that is the condition of these kinds of histories. And so, but at the same time, what we've been quite careful to do is to not repeat that in the work that we present. So, and to not assume that that is the only history that is present. So even though this kind of ways of thinking about histories of violence and coloniality are present throughout the pieces, I think they're dealt with in quite complex ways, but they're also not represented in, or I think in most cases they're represented in ways that I think can be quite moving, but are not asking for a reliving of it. And that, I think, is it's a decision that we've taken, that we think is important in order to move beyond a focus on that, and not necessarily move beyond, but move with and through that, rather, that.
Can I ask one question before we have a drink? I wanted to ask about desire, and so in a way, kind of in response to, in response to your response to my question earlier, I was thinking about the relationship between the desire to know or to document, and how that kind of changes our reading of a particular archive. And so I suppose in a way, if versus, for example, the desire of the archivist to present a particular narrative, or how the archivist wants it to be read. And as someone who, earlier we were speaking about how earlier today you were in an archive, how do you navigate that kind of relationship or that desire?
Very carefully. That's I think desire is a really great question, and I think also relates to this earlier one, thinking beyond, or in addition to violence, what are the other kinds of ways of engaging? I think I'm very interested in the work of Michel Rolf-Trouillot, who is a Haitian historian, and he argues that we often think of history as that which has happened in the past, but actually there's the telling of that past, and then there's the past as it was, and there isn't a clear distinction between those two. And so I guess maybe, I'm going to answer your question with his work, because I think what he has this reminder, and he calls it a duty, actually, to remember this double-sidedness with which we operate, that we are actors and narrators of history. And we're not always narrators of history, but I think, especially with a setting like this, we are to some extent, not claim our presence. And I think that would be how I often think of this work, is I think there's sometimes a we're all trying to do something, to ask some kinds of questions, and it's both about staying with that question and also thinking about, what is the work that we're trying to do, and why, and how does it sit within the world, and what does what does it do, is I think how I navigate it. That's
If there's no more questions, maybe that's a good place to end and get some canapes and drinks in the North Jury Room over there. Anybody? Last. Oh, Khalid. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Hello. Hi. I have a very ill-formed thought, but I think it's worth asking. So forgive me if it sounds like I'm rambling. But I think one thing. I mean, this was a really, really interesting talk. But I think one thing that I am struggling with, and I put this up for brainstorm, not as a critique for sure, is, in a sense, I feel like one of the things that the archive did in many parts of the world, and I'm generalizing here, is that it separated the practice of history from the popular imagination towards the realm of expertise, in a sense. So I think you were talking about, being actors of history. And while I think you really made a very, very kind of potent point on, relationally engaging the archive and finding the glitches in it, which I think was really fascinating. I wonder why, with the Archive of Forgetfulness, you took the decision to kind of stick with the modality. Maybe I'll end my question there, and I hope that made sense.
You mean the modality of the archive,
Yeah.
as a word? Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great question. I think that the way that I understand that, and I think even the way that I often use the word architecture in topics like this, is that as much as an archive means something very particular for people in archival studies, which is a state-run archive in a building designed by the state to hold state records, and that is that is kind of key definition. I think it's also like a lot of language used in different ways to mean very different things. And I think that it is in that slippage that I think that's a slippage we need to remember and also kind of activate, because I think that is a site of possibility. So and I think that in many ways that's what the project shows, because we decided to name it this with full knowledge of what the kind of archive usually is. And the kinds of responses we've got have been incredible, which actually show that the word means so much more than that official formal definition. And I think, I think that's how language operates. It's kind of, it travels, it moves, it changes meaning in different places. And I think that's really wonderful. I do think, though, that maybe to say, I think the other thing that this project shows, we're not all histories. There are other forms of knowledge. There are other forms of archives, maybe with different words, there are other forms of ways of telling history that have existed and do exist in many places, and that's also what this project shows. So, one of episode 8, I spoke a bit about Omar Barada's work, but I did an interview. It was a really bad quality interview, but with someone in northern Nigeria, in Ilorin, and he was talking about a manuscript tradition in northern Nigeria that is kept in people's houses. And these manuscripts are both, firstly, there's no necessarily a clear distinction between a sacred and a non-sacred text, which is another kind of fiction of the archive, but also that there are practices throughout the continent which are specifically around telling histories. It's not always popular. It's often with particular families or particular people who are holders of that knowledge. So, and that's the kind of, this project can be read in different ways, but that's actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that's quite important. As a continent which is primarily thought of as having oral knowledge, it does, and that's very important, but there's a whole lot of textual knowledge as well. There are very particular kinds of oral knowledge. So someone like Princess Mhlongo's work is also, Izitakazelo and Izibongo is a particular kind of oral history, actually, that traces particular lineages. So I think, there's different kinds of archives and there's different kinds of knowledges, and I think that's quite important to remember that we're not working in a kind of absence or emptiness. What we're actually trying to do is say, well, what are the possibilities of these?
Thank you for that.
Hi, thank you very much for that. I think I want to follow up on something you mentioned now, and you mentioned throughout the talk, is you said that you refer to architecture in this kind of work you presented in a specific way, and you said that you mostly refers kind of to the second part of your work. I'm thinking with boundaries and these kind of things that you talked about in relationship to things that are connected and disconnected, I was thinking about how a lot of the people you bring into this conversation are very sort of present in other disciplines, like more broad like visual cultures, how this like porosity between sort of humanities is much more sort of fluid or like contaminates, whereas architecture sort of, there's some sort of resistance towards some of these things. So for me, on the one hand, it was really interesting to see kind of your archival, curatorial, the term doesn't really matter. Like the practice that you're doing kind of comes into the sort of architectural history of Cape Town. But I would also argue that there's, an architectural sort of side to, your previous work. And maybe I wanted to ask your opinion about why do you think there's this sort of tension or this resistance, or is it Spivak is Hardman, like there's all these incredible theories, and then there's architecture profession full of males, and I'm not saying that's the only problem, but if there's some sort of, there's something that there's, where does the resistance come from? Maybe that's one of the questions. So, or where do you see this resistance, or where do you see this resistance kind of seeping, or like, I'm really sort of, I really struggle to see why there's so much intercommunication among anthropology and art, and architecture sort of sits back and looks and sort of doesn't really want to, not necessarily, but I feel that sort of separation. I don't know if you feel that, or I feel like your work is also trying to address that by you doing, bringing this work. So if you have any sort of thoughts or comments, or really a question. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. I think that's a big question. I suppose, part of the reason that I separated the two parts is because I think, as I was saying earlier, even though I do read the Archive of Forgetfulness as an architect and as a kind of architectural positioning, I think I'm the only one of the kind of co-curators who's an architect. So I think it's quite important to kind of acknowledge that clearly that was not part of the conversations, even if, definitely people work in spatial terms. Whereas in the second part of this presentation, part of what my work does is, my work is very interdisciplinary, but in this project, particularly around Cape Dutch architecture, I am trying to speak about what it means to think about architecture as a discipline quite directly, which is why I use the language. I think that architecture, I think there's amazing things happening, like, more recently, that are quite incredible in architectural schools, and is this kind of openness, but there also feels like there's a bit of like a closing down in different ways. For me, I see some of the issues, I think I see it as related to architecture's how it operates as a discipline and in the world as very much something that is, it holds on to power in a particular way. Architecture is not just what happens within schools, but it actually is this relationship between the academy and economics and finance and politics on the outside. And I think that there's been a lot of amazing work, but until that relationship is radically challenged, I think, which maybe will happen with the kinds of issues of climate crisis emerging. But, climate crisis is not new as well, so we can, I think until that happens, it's always going to be this field that kind of holds on. And holding on is because it's a holding on to power. But at the same time, I think architecture is an incredibly porous field, and I think it always has been. So, there's these kinds of ways of working that are always there, that are always interdisciplinary, that it draws and it gleans from other disciplines where it's convenient to, and maybe just needs to do more of that. But I do think there needs to be kind of quite a big rethinking of what it means in terms of practice.
I just wanted to add to that, and I think as an expansion of everything Huda said, if you read Bell Hooks's, I'm going to get the title wrong, Acting Within the Margins, as a as form of radical openness, it really expands on that, and I think we'll have a few answers for you. Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for staying, and let's go to the Northern Jury Room so that we can continue the conversation a bit more informally. Thanks, Huda.
Thank you.